Western North Carolina. Thanksgiving Day. I am sitting at a dinner table surrounded by monsters who wear the faces of my parents. My name is Leila Ross. The air is thick with the scent of sage and sweet potatoes, but underneath it is the metallic tang of betrayal, the radiators rattling against the mountain chill as my father slices the turkey and smiles about the fortune he stole from my medical fund. He thinks I am the dutiful daughter who will fade quietly into the wallpaper, but as the gravy boat passes from hand to hand, I am not thinking about forgiveness. I am calculating exactly how to burn their world down. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. If you had walked into my parents' farmhouse in Western North Carolina that Thanksgiving, you would have seen the perfect American holiday. It was a scene straight out of a magazine, the kind of image that makes you ache for a home you never had. The old radiators were clanking against the mountain chill. The television in the den was blaring the Lions game, and the air was thick with the smell of sage stuffing roasted turkey and my mother's famous marshmallow-topped sweet potato casserole. There were cousins yelling over a card game in the corner, and church friends laughing in the kitchen, their voices rising over the clatter of silverware. On the walls, framed photos of us kids, me and my younger brother Aiden, smiled down from better, simpler years. I sat there nursing a glass of iced tea, leaning back in the hard wooden chair to relieve the pressure in my lower spine. I looked around the room and felt a rare, fleeting sense of peace. I thought this trip home would be the last peaceful holiday before my life changed. I thought I was surrounded by the people who loved me most in the world. I had no idea I was walking into an ambush. I'm Leila Ross. At the time, I was 28 years old, working as a project manager for a massive logistics company in Charlotte. I spent my days putting out fires for other people, managing supply chains, and ensuring nothing ever fell through the cracks. I was good at it. I had to be. I had moved out of this farmhouse years ago, but in many ways I never really left. My bank account was still tethered to this place by an invisible, unbreakable umbilical cord. I paid the mortgage on this house temporarily when my dad's hardware store struggled. I covered Aiden's car insurance because he was between opportunities. I sent cash transfers instantly when the water heater broke, or the roof leaked, or the truck needed a transmission. I was single, straight, and utterly exhausted. I didn't date because I didn't have the energy or the spare cash to explain why my life was an endless series of family emergencies. I was in survival mode, keeping my head down, working 60-hour weeks to keep everyone else afloat while my own body was quietly falling apart. But this Thanksgiving was supposed to be the turning point. I had a plan. I had a solution. The burning nerve pain that radiated down my right leg, the numbness that woke me up in tears at 3:00 a.m., was finally going to end. I had a spinal fusion surgery scheduled for January. It was a terrifying procedure, but necessary to stop the degeneration that was threatening to put me in a wheelchair before I turned 35. I had saved for it. I had scraped and sacrificed and built a war chest of $160,000, a massive deposit required by the specialists because of the complex, out-of-network nature of the reconstruction. That money was my lifeline. It was my freedom. We sat down for dinner around 4 o'clock. The table was groaning under the weight of the food. My father, Mark, stood at the head of the table, electric carving knife in hand, looking like the patriarch of the year. My mother, Denise, was fluttering around, filling wine glasses, her face flushed with the hostess high. Aiden sat across from me, looking distinctively more polished than usual. He was wearing a designer watch I knew he couldn't afford, and a crisp button-down that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. He was smiling, charming the aunties, talking about his brand and his metrics. The conversation lulled as everyone dug in. It was that golden hour of eating where the only sounds are forks scraping china and satisfied sighs. I was relaxed. My guard was down. I looked at my mom, who was buttering a roll, and asked the question that had been on my mind all week. It was casual, just a logistical check-in. "Hey, Mom," I said, reaching for the cranberry sauce. Did the hospital mail the confirmation letter with my surgery date yet? They said they sent it to this address since it's my permanent record on file. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It rippled out slowly. My mom's hand paused over the butter dish. She exchanged a quick loaded look with my father. It was a look I had seen 1,000 times before, a secret language of shared burdens, but usually, it was about a bill I needed to pay. This time it felt different. It felt heavy. My dad cleared his throat. He didn't look up. He kept slicing the turkey, the electric knife buzzing aggressively against the silence. "Oh yeah," he said, his voice breezy, almost bored. "Something came last week. But we took care of it." I frowned, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. "Took care of it? What do you mean I need that packet for the pre-op blood work?" My mother put on her brightest, most brittle smile. "We handled the deposit situation, Leila. You don't need to worry about the surgery right now. We reallocated those funds." The room seemed to tilt. The chatter from the cousins at the kids' table sounded like it was coming from underwater. Reallocated. I repeated the word, tasting like ash. "That's $160,000, Dad. It's in the trust account. You can't reallocate it. It's for the surgeon." "For the good of the family," Dad said, finally setting the knife down. He looked me in the eye, and there was no shame there, only a terrifying, righteous certainty. "Your brother turns 30 next month, Leila. 30. That is a milestone. You know how hard he's been trying to get his business off the ground. He needed a launch event. He needed visibility." I looked at Aiden. He was staring intensely at his mashed potatoes, studying the peaks and valleys as if they held the secrets of the universe. He knew. He had known the whole time. "We used the money to book the mountain resort for the weekend." Mom added, her voice soothing, as if explaining to a toddler why they couldn't have candy for dinner. "A full buyout. Catering, influencers, the works. It's an investment, honey. Your brother only turns 30 once. We sacrificed a lot to get him where he is. This was the push he needed. The surgery can wait a few months. You're strong. You've always been the strong one." I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I went completely, utterly numbness. It was the feeling of being erased. All those years of eating ramen in my car, of skipping vacations, of working through Christmas, of ignoring the fire in my spine so I could send them checks, it meant nothing. To them, I was just a resource, a battery to be drained until it was dry, then discarded. My pain was hypothetical to them. Aiden's ego was urgent. I carefully set my fork down on the fine china. The metallic clink sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The aunties had stopped eating. The cousins were watching. I looked at my parents, these people who claimed to love me, and then at my brother, who was wearing my spinal fusion on his wrist. "So," I said, my voice very soft, very calm, "you spent the surgery money, without ever asking whose body they were planning to cut open." The table went dead silent. You could hear the wind rattling the window panes. Aiden shrank into his chair, finally looking up, his eyes pleading with me not to make a scene, not to ruin his moment. My mother gasped, hand to her chest, looking offended that I would bring up something as vulgar as my body at the dinner table. I stood up. My legs were trembling, not from the nerve damage this time, but from a rage so pure it felt like clarity. To understand how my own family could steal my future, and then smile about it over turkey and gravy, you have to see what I'd already given up for them. You have to understand that this wasn't the first time they had ambushed me. It was just the first time I realized they were never going to stop. To understand why I didn't flip that table, you have to understand that my conditioning started a decade ago. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow drip of guilt and duty that eventually eroded my ability to say no. In my early 20s, I was already the designated fixer. I had scraped my way into college on a partial scholarship, working 2 jobs, one at the campus library, one waiting tables at a dive bar until 2:00 a.m., not to buy clothes or go on spring break, but to wire money home. Every month the narrative was the same. We're all in this together, Leila. The hardware store had a bad quarter. We sacrificed our retirement for your braces for your childhood. They framed my existence as a debt I could never quite pay off. Then came the accident. I was 23 driving home from a double shift when a drunk driver blew a red light and T-boned my sedan. The impact didn't kill me, but it shattered the tranquility of my life. The doctors called it complex spinal trauma. I called it the beginning of the end. The settlement from the other driver's insurance was substantial enough to secure my future if managed right, but I was young, drugged up on painkillers and lying in a hospital bed with a brace around my neck. That's when Mark and Denise positioned themselves as the wise guardians. They sat by my bedside holding my hand, their faces etched with concern. "We're your parents, Leila," my dad had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're too young to handle this kind of cash. Vultures will come out of the woodwork. Let us help manage it so nobody takes advantage of you." I signed the documents. I signed them because I trusted them more than I trusted myself. I signed them because I felt guilty that I had this windfall while they were struggling to keep the lights on. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Over the next few years, the pattern became a suffocating rhythm. Every time I started to climb ahead, every time I saved a little for a down payment or a vacation, my family ambushed me with another emergency. I'd get a call from Mom sobbing so hard I could barely understand her, claiming the mortgage was 3 months behind and the bank was threatening foreclosure. I'd get a text from Dad saying the delivery truck for his business was about to be repossessed. Then there was Aiden. He was always investing in his brand, always needing just a few thousand more to not fall behind his peers. I was living in a studio apartment with drafty windows, eating instant ramen, and skipping doctor's appointments to save the copay, while my money flowed south to keep them comfortable. I told myself I was a good daughter. I told myself this was what families did. But my body had a different timeline. By 27, the pain wasn't just an annoyance. It was a siren. My neurologist, Dr. Evans, sat me down 6 months ago and showed me the MRI. The vertebrae were grinding together. The nerves were being compressed. "This isn't about pain management anymore, Leila," he had said, pointing to the glowing image of my ruined spine. "You're looking at permanent loss of function. If we don't fuse this within the year, you could lose the use of your right leg. You could lose bladder control. There is a ticking clock here." That terrified me into action. I stopped sending the extra fun money home. I spoke to HR, to a financial advisor at my bank, and I set up a designated medical trust. I moved the remaining settlement money and every cent of my savings into it. It was strictly for the surgery. I locked it down. But, and this is where my own heart betrayed me, I added one emergency clause. The banker had suggested it. "What if you're in a coma? Leila, what if you're unreachable and there's a life or death situation?" So I authorized my parents to request funds only with verification of a critical family emergency. I never imagined they would weaponize my own death against me. The discovery happened 2 days before Thanksgiving. I was packing my bag ready to drive home when I logged into my banking app to check the balance. I just wanted to see the number to reassure myself that my future was safe. The screen loaded. My stomach dropped through the floor. Available balance $0, $0. I stared at the phone, blinking, sure it was a glitch. I refreshed the page. 0. I called the bank immediately, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I got Mr. Whitaker, the branch manager, who knew my situation. "Leila?" He sounded confused. "I thought you were in Europe. We processed the wire yesterday." "Europe?" I choked out. "I'm in my apartment in Charlotte. What are you talking about?" There was a long pause on the line, the sound of typing. "Your mother called," Mr. Whitaker said slowly, his voice dropping. "She was hysterical. She said you were overseas for work and unreachable, and that your brother was in critical condition. She sent over the authorization email from your account. It matched your writing style perfectly, Leila. It had all the security answers. We released the funds under the emergency clause." "Where did the money go?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer wasn't a hospital. "2 transfers," he read. "One to Prestige Mountain Resort and Spa, the other to a business account labeled Aiden Ross Global Event Co. The room spun. They hadn't just stolen from me, they had impersonated me. They had used my fear of losing them to rob me of my ability to walk. Denise had called up that bank sobbing fake tears about a dying son just to pay for bottle service and a DJ. The nausea hit me in waves, but then something inside me snapped. It was a cold, hard click, like a lock engaging. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a crystalline rage. "I'm done," I said to the empty room. "I'm done letting them threaten my future every time they're uncomfortable." I didn't cancel the trip home. I needed to look them in the eye when I dropped the bomb. But right then, sitting on my bed with my bank account empty, I opened my laptop. I logged into every utility portal, every streaming service, every credit card portal where I was an authorized user. I went down the list. Parents' mortgage remove autopay, Aiden's car insurance cancel policy, Dad's business credit line freeze card, cell phone family plan, suspend lines. I cut them off. I severed every financial artery that pumped my blood into their lives. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the screen illuminating my face, and waited for the fallout. I knew the explosion was coming. I just didn't realize that by the time I arrived for dinner, they would have already spent the money laughing about how easy it was to trick the daughter who loved them too much. It was 2 a.m. when the war finally came to my doorstep. I was back in my small apartment in Charlotte, sitting in the dark, staring at the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across my living room floor. I hadn't slept since Thanksgiving. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, as he sliced that turkey unbothered by the fact that he had cannibalized my future. I was waiting for the backlash. I knew my family too well to think they would accept my silence as a resignation. They viewed my money as their birthright, and when you cut off a parasite, it doesn't just fall away quietly, it fights to burrow deeper. Then the pounding started. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a violent assault on the wood that shook the doorframe, rattling the pictures on my walls. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to look through the peephole. I knew. I could feel the radiation of their anger through the drywall. I walked to the door, my bare feet cold on the floorboards, and unlocked the deadbolt. I didn't even have to turn the handle. The door was shoved open from the outside, hitting the stopper with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. They poured into my sanctuary like a black water flood. Denise came first, her face streaked with mascara, clutching a fistful of crumpled papers. Mark was right behind her, red-faced veins bulging in his neck, pacing immediately, as if the square footage of my living room wasn't enough to contain his fury. And trailing them was Aiden. He didn't look like the confident entrepreneur from the dinner table anymore. He looked pale, sweaty, and panicked the way he used to look when he broke a window playing baseball as a kid, terrified of the consequences, but expecting me to sweep up the glass. "You blindsided us." My father roared, spinning around to face me. He looked massive in my small entryway, sucking up all the oxygen. "You cut everything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I know exactly what I did." I said, my voice shaking but my feet planted firm. "I stopped paying for a life I'm not living." "You humiliated your brother!" Denise screamed, thrusting the papers at my chest. They fluttered to the floor, declined transaction receipts, late notices, overdraft alerts. His American Express was declined in front of his investors. The resort tried to charge the incidentals to the card on file, and it bounced Leila. They threatened to call the police on him, on his birthday weekend. "And his car note," Mark added, pointing a finger at me like a weapon. "The bank called me today. They're coming for the truck. You stopped the auto draft. How could you be so vindictive?" I looked at them, truly looked at them, and felt a wave of nausea. They weren't here to apologize for stealing the $160,000 meant to save my spine. They weren't here to ask if I was okay. They were here because the tap had run dry and they were thirsty. Vindictive. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You forged my signature. You called my bank pretending to be me. You stole my surgery money to throw a party, and you're screaming at me because I won't pay for the cleanup. This family runs on what you provide." Mark stepped closer, his voice dropping into that low, growling register that used to terrify me when I was a teenager. You stop, we all stop. That is the agreement. That is how we survive. That is how we sacrificed for you all those years, keeping a roof over your head, raising you. You didn't sacrifice. I shot back, the words tearing out of my throat. You spent everything I earned like it was already yours. You didn't just use me, you tried to erase me. You looked at my medical records, saw that I needed help, and decided a party was more important. The air in the room shifted. Denise collapsed onto my sofa, burying her face in her hands, weaponizing her motherhood in an instant. She began to sob loud, heaving cries that were meant to break me down. After everything we've done for you, she wailed into her palms. I carried you, I raised you, and this is how you repay your parents, by leaving us to drown, by destroying your brother's reputation. Aiden stepped forward, then trying to play the role that had worked for him for 30 years, the golden child with potential. Lay, come on, he pleaded, his voice cracking. I just need a bridge loan, just until the brand deals hit next month. I'm going to blow up soon, I swear. I'll pay you back double. Just unfreeze the cards. Please, I can't lose the car. I looked at him, a 30-year-old man begging his sister to fix his mess while standing in the apartment he helped rob. No, I said. It was a small word, but it felt heavy, like a stone dropping into a deep well. The sobbing stopped. Mark stopped pacing. Aiden blinked. What? No, I repeated louder this time. I'm done funding you. I'm done being your safety net. I'm done being ambushed by emergencies that are just your bad decisions wrapped in guilt. Get out. Mark leaned in then, invading my personal space until I could smell the stale coffee and aggression on his breath. His eyes were cold, calculating. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was a strategic pivot. You're not thinking clearly, Leila. You're hysterical. You're under a lot of stress with this health thing. It's making you irrational. I have never been more rational in my life, I said, meeting his gaze. If you keep this up, he whispered, the threat distinct and terrifying, we will have no choice but to step in. For your own good. We can't let you ruin this family because you're having a breakdown. I'm not having a breakdown, I said, walking to the door and throwing it wide open to the hallway. I'm having a breakthrough. Get out of my house. For a second, I thought he might hit me. His hand twitched at his side. But the neighbors were starting to stir. A door clicked open down the hall. Mark straightened up, adjusting his jacket. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were a broken appliance that needed to be recalled. They filed out. Denise stopped at the threshold, her eyes dry now, the tears miraculous gone. She looked at me with a chilling emptiness. You think you can just walk away from your family? She hissed. You'll regret this, Leila. We won't let you destroy everything we've built. I slammed the door and locked it. I slid the chain in place. I sank to the floor, shaking, listening to their footsteps retreat down the hall. I thought it was over. I thought I had drawn the line and they would finally have to face their own lives. I thought they had cut me off emotionally because I was no longer useful. I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a thick manila envelope taped to my door. It wasn't from the bank. It wasn't from Aiden. It was from the county court. I tore it open right there in the hallway, my keys still in my hand. I pulled out a stack of legal documents, heavy and official. My eyes scanned the cover page and my heart stopped beating. It was a petition for guardianship. I read the words, but my brain refused to process them. Petitioner Mark and Denise Ross. Respondent Leila Ross. They weren't suing me for money. They were petitioning the state to declare me incompetent. They were claiming I was mentally unstable, a danger to myself, and incapable of managing my own affairs. I stood there paralyzed as the realization washed over me. I thought they had just come to my apartment to scream at me. I didn't realize my own parents were about to try and legally erase me. They didn't want a relationship. They wanted ownership. And looking at the court seal, I realized they had already started the paperwork before they even knocked on my door. The text of the petition blurred before my eyes, not because I was crying, but because my brain simply couldn't reconcile the legal descriptions with my actual life. In the black and white starkness of the court documents, I wasn't Leila Ross, the project manager, with a pristine credit score and a 10-year work history. I was Leila Ross, the respondent, a woman described as financially reckless, mentally unstable, and actively threatening self-harm. The petition requested that Mark and Denise Ross be appointed as the permanent guardians of my person and estate, citing urgent concern for my physical safety and the family's dependence on her income, which they twisted to sound like I was irrationally withholding support due to a manic episode. They were trying to seize legal control of my body, my bank accounts, and my voice. I flipped to the exhibits, and the nausea returned. They hadn't just filed a form, they had built a fictional universe. There were affidavits attached, sworn statements signed under penalty of perjury. The first was from a Dr. Eris, a therapist I had never met in my life, claiming I had been a patient for 6 months and exhibited severe persecutory delusions and erratic spending patterns. The next was from neighbors in my apartment complex, names I didn't recognize, alleging that I screamed at all hours of the night and threw objects against the walls. There was even a statement from a barista at a coffee shop I occasionally visited, claiming she watched me collapse sobbing about ending it all in the middle of the morning rush. As I read them, a chill went down my spine. The language in all 3 affidavits was nearly identical. The phrasing, the cadence, the specific use of the words unhinged and belligerent, it was all Mark. He had written these. He had orchestrated a chorus of lies to drown out my reality. The assault on my life didn't stop with the paperwork. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my keycard didn't work. I was escorted to HR, where a grim-faced director handed me a notice. My health insurance had been suspended pending a fraud investigation. I sat there stunned as she explained that tens of thousands of dollars in claims had been submitted in my name over the last month for inpatient rehabilitation and crisis stabilization at a facility 3 hours away. I had been at work every single day those claims were filed. When I got home and called the insurance company screaming that I had never been to rehab, the fraud department ran a trace on the digital submissions. The claims had been filed online. The IP address didn't match a hospital or a clinic. It traced back to a residential address in western North Carolina, my parents' farmhouse. They weren't just trying to control me. They were using my identity to milk the insurance system for cash, likely to cover the debts they'd racked up on Aiden's party. The humiliation hit its peak 3 nights later. I was eating dinner toast and peanut butter because I was too anxious to cook when blue and red lights flashed against my living room blinds. A heavy knock followed. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed police officers stood there, hands resting near their belts. Neighbors were peeking out of their doors, whispering. The officers told me they had received a 911 call from a concerned family member stating that I was currently attempting suicide. They didn't ask if it was true. They barged past me, flashlights sweeping my clean, quiet apartment. They opened my bathroom cabinets, checking for pills. They looked under my bed. They treated me like a criminal in my own sanctuary. I stood in the middle of the room, shaking, trying to explain that I was fine, that this was harassment, but they looked at me with skepticism. My parents had already poisoned the well. Finally, the older officer lowered his flashlight. He looked around the tidy room, saw the work laptop open on the table, the uneaten toast. He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw not a manic woman, but a terrified one. He stepped closer, his voice low so the neighbors couldn't hear. "Ma'am," he said, "we get a lot of welfare checks. Usually the people calling are crying, scared for someone they love. The people who called tonight, they were calm, too calm. They gave us specific instructions on how to enter." He paused, his eyes hard. "Anyone who would do this to you, they're not trying to help you. They're trying to control you." That night I stopped crying. I reached out to Hannah Clark, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney I knew through a logistics contract at work. I met her at a diner at midnight, slamming the petition and the insurance fraud notices onto the table. Hannah read through them, her jaw tightening with every page. When she finished, she looked up, her expression grave. "They're trying to put you in a legal cage, Leila," she said. "If they win this guardianship, you become a legal non-person. They control your body. They decide if you get that surgery. They control every dime you earn. They can legally force you to move back into that farmhouse." "How do we stop them?" I asked. "We don't just defend," Hannah said, pulling out a legal pad. "We attack. We gather everything. Bank records, emails, texts. We subpoena the IP logs for the insurance claims. We get affidavits from your real doctors, your boss, your actual neighbors." She tapped her pen on the table. "And I know a detective, Luis Ortega. He hates using his squad for fake welfare checks. We're going to bring him in." But while we built our case, my world was shrinking. The rumors had already started swirling through the community back home. I got texts from church members and old friends not asking how I was, but offering prayers for my recovery, and saying they heard I was struggling with demons. My parents were controlling the narrative, painting themselves as the martyrs carrying the cross of a crazy daughter. It was me against the entire history of my family. A week later, the notice arrived. The court date was set. I sat in Hannah's office staring at the calendar. The room felt cold. "This is it," Hannah said, leaning forward. "The clerk can decide your entire life before lunch. The burden of proof is on them, but they have mud to throw. We're either going to stop them or watch them erase you in real time." I looked out the window at the courthouse down the street. It looked like a fortress. I knew that when I walked through those doors, I wouldn't be walking out as the same person. I was either walking out free, or I was never walking out at all. The morning of the hearing, the sky over the Buncombe County Courthouse was a bruising shade of gray, threatening rain that never quite fell. I walked up the stone steps with Hannah beside me, my stomach twisting into knots so tight they felt like physical blows. The gallery was already full when we pushed through the heavy oak doors. It wasn't just strangers, it was the community. People I had grown up with, deacons from our old church neighbors who had known me since I was in pigtails. They were all there, whispering behind cupped hands. They looked at me with a mix of morbid curiosity and pity, the way you look at a car crash. To them, I was already the tragedy my parents had painted, the unstable daughter who had lost her mind. I took my seat at the respondents' table. My hands were trembling, so I clasped them on the polished wood to steady them. Across the aisle, my parents sat with their attorney. They were dressed in their Sunday best. Mark in a suit that was slightly too tight, Denise in a modest navy dress. They looked devastated. They looked like loving parents who were being forced to do the unthinkable to save their child. In the row directly behind them sat Aiden, slouching, scrolling on his phone, looking bored rather than concerned. The proceedings began, and their lawyer didn't waste time. He painted a portrait of a woman I didn't recognize. He described me as overworked, isolated, and rapidly deteriorating. He claimed my parents had sacrificed their retirement, their home equity, and their golden years to provide for my care, only for me to turn on them in a fit of paranoia. Mark wiped away a tear at the perfect moment. Denise dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders shaking. The gallery murmured sympathetically. It was a performance, and it was working. Then it was Hannah's turn. She didn't offer an emotional opening statement. She simply stood up and began to dismantle their fiction brick by brick. Her first witness was my surgeon. He took the stand looking grave. He confirmed my spinal diagnosis in clinical, undeniable terms. He testified that without the surgery, I faced permanent disability. When Hannah asked about the payment, he stated clearly, the deposit of $160,000 was received, and then without medical authorization, it was withdrawn. Next came Mr. Whitaker, the banker. He was the first crack in their armor. He projected the email authorizing the transfer on the courtroom screen. This email appeared to come from Ms. Ross, he testified, but the metadata shows it was sent from a device registered to Mark Ross. Furthermore, the verbal authorization came from a woman claiming to be Ms. Ross, who stated the funds were for a family emergency. "And where did the funds go, Mr. Whitaker?" Hannah asked. "To a luxury resort and an event planning account," he replied. The gallery grew quieter, the whispering stopped. Hannah then called Detective Ortega. He sat heavily in the witness chair, his uniform stark against the wood paneling. He recounted the multiple welfare checks, the 911 calls claiming I was suicidal. In every instance, he said, his voice deep and resonating, Ms. Ross was calm, sober, and safe. The calls all originated from the petitioner's home number. In my professional opinion, the police were being used as a tool for harassment, not welfare. But the death blow came when Hannah dimmed the lights and turned on the projector again. "Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Marianne Collins, "the petitioners claim the respondent's money was used for an emergency. I'd like to show you that emergency." On the screen blown up 4 feet high were screenshots of Aiden's Instagram stories. The timestamps matched the date of the wire transfer perfectly. There was the mountain lodge glowing in the twilight. There was a giant neon sign that read, Aiden 30. There were bottles of champagne with sparklers attached to them. And there were the captions. Best 30th ever read one. Sacrifices made to make this happen, read another. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, hollow ache in my chest. Every spark in that sky was a piece of my future burning. Every bottle of champagne was a month of physical therapy I would never get. The courtroom was silent now. The sacrificing parents' narrative was dissolving under the neon glow of my brother's narcissism. Hannah wasn't done. She brought up 2 of the neighbors who had signed affidavits claiming I was crazy. Under cross-examination, they crumbled. One admitted she hadn't seen me in 3 years. The other couldn't remember which apartment I lived in. Hannah produced the notary's logbook showing that every single affidavit had been signed on the same day at the same hour in my parents' kitchen. It wasn't a collection of concerns. It was a conspiracy. Finally, I took the stand. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just told the truth. For 10 years, I said, my voice steady in the silent room, I have been the safety net for this family. I paid the mortgage. I paid the car notes. I put my own life on hold. I looked directly at Judge Collins. My parents didn't just steal my money to throw a party. When I finally said no, they tried to erase me on paper. They tried to take away my legal rights so they could keep spending me until there was nothing left. Judge Collins looked at me. Then she turned her gaze to Mark and Denise. Her expression had shifted from impartial to disgusted. She shuffled the papers on her bench, the sound loud in the stillness. In 20 years on the bench, Judge Collins said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, I have rarely seen such a transparent abuse of the legal system. She looked at my parents. Mark was staring at the table. Denise had stopped crying. Her face was pale. I find no evidence of incompetence, the judge ruled. I do, however, find overwhelming evidence of fraud, perjury, and financial exploitation. She slammed her gavel. The petition for guardianship is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering the petitioners to pay all of Ms. Ross's legal fees, and I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation regarding the insurance fraud and forgery. The gavel hit the wood again. Bang! The sound echoed like a gunshot. A murmur rippled through the gallery, not of pity this time, but of shock. The community finally saw the truth. The mask had fallen off. I stood up. I felt lightheaded, as if gravity had suddenly released its hold on me. Hannah squeezed my arm, smiling. I walked toward the aisle. Mark and Denise wouldn't look at me. They were huddled with their lawyer, looking small and terrified. But as I passed the row behind them, Aiden stood up. He looked shell-shocked. He looked from his parents, who were now arguing in hushed, frantic tones with their attorney, to me. You, Aiden stammered, his voice trembling. You really did all that. You testified against them. They're going to be investigated to your own parents. I stopped. I looked at my brother, the boy I had protected for so long, the man who had celebrated his birthday with the pieces of my spine. This is where I stop being your safety net, I said. I turned my back on them and pushed open the heavy doors. I stepped out of the courthouse and into the daylight. The rain hadn't fallen. The sun was breaking through the gray clouds, blinding and bright. I was free. I didn't know yet what the cost would be. My leg was throbbing and my bank account was still empty. But as I took that first breath of fresh air, I knew one thing for certain: I belonged to myself again. The gavel coming down didn't end the war, it just changed the battlefield. In the weeks following the hearing, the silence I had prayed for didn't come. Instead, it was replaced by the chaotic noise of a life being dismantled. The district attorney didn't drag his feet. The evidence Hannah had compiled, the forged IP logs, the fake insurance claims, the fraudulent bank transfers, was too overwhelming to ignore. Mark and Denise were formally indicted for insurance fraud and forgery. The pillars of the community, the couple who sat in the third pew every Sunday, were suddenly being fingerprinted. The fallout was immediate and visceral. You find out who your real friends are when your family mugshots hit the local paper. The reaction in town was split down a jagged line. Some people, the ones who had whispered about me in the grocery store, suddenly couldn't look me in the eye, but others dug in. I received letters from church ladies and distant cousins trying to justify the unjustifiable. They were just scared, one note read. They didn't mean to harm you. They just lost their way. You have to forgive. It was a masterclass in denial. I realized then that a lot of people prefer the comfortable myth of the sacrificing parents over the ugly reality of what Mark and Denise actually did. It was easier for them to believe I was cruel than to accept that parents could cannibalize their own child. But no amount of denial could stop the financial collapse. My parents had spent everything they had fighting the guardianship petition, and now facing criminal defense fees and court-ordered restitution, they were drowning. The farmhouse, the symbol of our family's legacy, went into foreclosure. The bank didn't care about their standing in the community. They just cared that the mortgage hadn't been paid in 6 months because the money had gone to lawyers. Aiden's fall was faster and louder. The internet is a fickle beast. When the court transcripts became public record, the narrative around his launch party shifted overnight. His sponsors dropped him like he was radioactive. The photos of him popping champagne at the mountain lodge, which he had pinned to the top of his profile, were flooded with comments calling him a fraud and a thief. His brand wasn't built on success. It was built on my stolen spinal fluid. He took the account down within 48 hours. Then came the begging. It started with text messages, then emails, then voicemails from blocked numbers. Just one more loan, Leila, please. You wouldn't leave your family on the street, would you? We're losing the house. We forgive you for the court case, just help us fix this. The audacity was breathtaking. They forgave me, I didn't engage. I didn't type a single reply. I routed everything through Hannah. Ms. Ross will not be communicating with you directly, she told them. Any further contact will be considered harassment. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, ignoring the ringing phone, but I knew that if I picked up even once, they would find the crack in my armor and pry it open. The hardest reality to face, however, wasn't the guilt, it was the physical cost. The delay caused by the theft of my funds meant the surgical window had narrowed. By the time I scraped together enough money through a new loan and insurance appeals to finally get the procedure, the damage to my nerves was more severe than it would have been months prior. The surgery was a success, but it wasn't a miracle. I didn't wake up pain-free. I woke up with a permanent limp and a right leg that sometimes felt like it was buzzing with static. I walked with a cane for months, and I knew I would have to manage this for the rest of my life. But I was walking. I wasn't in a wheelchair. I threw myself into physical therapy with a ferocity that scared my therapists. I wasn't building my body back for my parents anymore. I was building it for me. Slowly, the color started to come back into my world. I stopped rushing home to hide. My co-workers who had watched the drama unfold with horrified support started inviting me out not to vent, but just to be. I went to game nights where the stakes were nothing higher than bragging rights. I joined a small group at a new church in Charlotte where nobody knew my last name or my history. I experienced community that didn't require an entrance fee. I learned that love isn't a transaction. I even started dating again. It was slow, terrifying, and wonderful. I met a guy named David, a teacher who listened when I said I was tired and didn't try to fix it, just offered to make dinner. He treated me with a gentle care that felt foreign, almost suspicious at first, until I realized that this is how it's supposed to be. He didn't see me as a utility, he saw me as a person. The final severance happened 8 months later. Because my name was still on the deed of the farmhouse, a tactic my parents had used years ago to help their credit score, I had legal leverage. As part of the foreclosure and restitution deal, Hannah pushed a forced sale. My parents had to leave. I used my portion of the equity sale money that was rightfully mine money I had poured into that black hole for a decade to wipe my slate clean. I paid off the medical loans. I paid off my credit cards. And I put the rest into a high-yield savings account that absolutely no one had access to but me. I moved out of my apartment into a new place, a sunny condo on the other side of the city, far away from the memories of late-night knocks on the door. But before I handed over the keys, I had to do one last thing. I drove back to western North Carolina. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered. The grass was overgrown and the for sale sign was crooked in the yard. The house was empty now. My parents had moved into a small rental 2 towns over. I walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking under my feet. This was the porch where I had sat as a child waiting for my dad to come home. This was the door I had walked through for that Thanksgiving dinner thinking I was safe. I signed the closing papers on the railing, the pen scratching loud in the quiet mountain air. I looked out over the valley. It was beautiful, but it wasn't mine. It never had been. This is where I learned that love meant sacrificing myself, I whispered to the empty house. Today is the last day I believe that lie. I left the keys on the hook, walked down the steps, and got into my car. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror as I drove away. The road ahead was winding and uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I was the one driving. It has been 2 years since I walked out of that courthouse, and sometimes in the quiet of the morning, I still catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the silence in my new apartment isn't heavy anymore. It's peaceful. I live in a modest condo now, situated on a floor high enough to catch the morning light. The walls are painted a soft cream, not the oppressive dark wood of the farmhouse, and the only pictures hanging are ones I chose: landscapes, abstracts, memories of trips I finally took. There are no shrines to a family that demanded worship. My life today looks nothing like the survival mode I existed in for a decade. I'm still a project manager, but I work for a firm that respects boundaries. When I leave at 5, my phone stays off. David and I are still together. He's the kind of partner who sees my limp not as a defect, but as part of my history. Last week, when I flinched because a glass shattered in the kitchen, he didn't yell or make it about him. He just swept it up and asked if I was okay. It's a quiet, boring kind of love, and after a lifetime of fireworks and explosions, boring is exactly what I need. I have a circle of friends now, my chosen family. We do potlucks on Fridays. We help each other move furniture. We celebrate wins without asking for a cut of the prize money. It's a community built on mutual respect, not mutual debt. As for the people who share my DNA, their world has shrunk as much as mine has expanded. The criminal investigation dragged on for months, but eventually Mark and Denise took a plea deal to avoid jail time. They pled guilty to lesser charges of fraud and forgery. They avoided prison, but they couldn't avoid the social sentence. They live in a cramped rental duplex on the edge of town now. They aren't the pillars of the church anymore. They're the cautionary tale whispered about during coffee hour. They lost the hardware store, the farmhouse, and their status. I don't visit. I don't call. I heard through the grapevine that my dad tells anyone who will listen that his ungrateful daughter ruined him, clinging to his martyrdom like a life raft. Let him have it. I don't need his narrative to be true for my life to be good. Aiden is a different story. The influencer dream died the day the foreclosure sign went up. He works a regular 9 to 5 now, selling insurance. It's humble work, real work. Every few months, I get an email from him. Hannah forwards them to me, filtering out any requests for money, though, to his credit, there haven't been any lately. His last message was short. It said simply, "I didn't understand the cost until I watched them fall. I'm sorry I let them eat you to feed me." I believe him. I think he finally woke up from the trance of being the golden child. I have compassion for him from a distance, but I don't reply. I can forgive him without inviting him back in to break things again. I am not a fixer anymore. My body will never be perfect. The surgery stopped the paralysis, but the delay left its mark. I have days where the nerve pain flares, days where my right leg feels heavy and clumsy. I can't run marathons, but I can walk. I can hike easy trails. I can stand on my own 2 feet. That physical resilience mirrors the internal work I've done. I rebuilt my life from the rubble of legal and emotional warfare. I reclaimed my name, my credit, and my medical autonomy. In a very American sense, I secured my own freedom. I realized that personal liberty isn't just about laws. It's about the right to say no to the people who claim to own you. That hard-won freedom gave me a new mission. Every Tuesday night, I drive to a legal aid clinic downtown. I volunteer as a peer advocate for young adults facing financial exploitation or abusive guardianship proceedings. I sit across from 20-year-olds who look tired and scared, clutching bank statements that don't add up, telling stories about parents who borrowed their identity or managed their trust funds into oblivion. I listen to them. I validate them. And then I help them organize their paperwork. I use my story carefully, anonymously, sharing just enough to let them know they aren't crazy and they aren't alone. I tell them, "You are not an asset, you are a person." Watching the light come back into their eyes is the best therapy I could ask for. Standing on my balcony this morning, watching the city of Charlotte wake up below me, I feel a profound sense of clarity. The sky is bleeding from purple to gold, the sun cresting over the skyline. The air is crisp. For years, I believed love meant letting my family threaten my future every time they felt scared. I believed I had been born to sacrifice for them, even if it erased me completely. I thought being a good daughter meant setting myself on fire to keep them warm. Now I know the truth. I'm not here to be my parents' retirement plan. I'm not here to bankroll my brother's ego. I'm not here to be erased. My family tried to destroy me on paper. They tried to lock me in a cage of guilt and legal red tape. But I'm still here. I'm standing in the sun, holding a cup of coffee paid for with my own money in a home that is safe. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool morning air. I chose myself. And that choice didn't just save my future, it saved my life. Leila finally found peace on that balcony, proving that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away completely. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit the like button and subscribe to support the channel. Let us know below, would you have forgiven them? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.